You're tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
I do want to spend some time talking about Afghanistan here, which has been one of the bigger election issues just because the election was called in the midst of this crisis, which is both a military and a humanitarian crisis. The Conservatives, a bunch of MPs, or not MPs, rather, candidates, did a press conference the other day in which they talked about their plan. And the Conservatives have pushed for the Liberals to suspend their campaign, at least the Liberals who have cabinet portfolios tied to what's happening in Afghanistan. And I wanted to expand on that a bit because Alex Ruff, who is a Canadian Armed Forces veteran himself who served in Afghanistan, had some very interesting thoughts about the mission itself and about where we are as a country. And I wanted to extrapolate on some of those with Alex Ruff, the Conservative candidate seeking re-election in Bruce Grey Owen Sound. I was going to say the MP. You're not the MP anymore with Parliament having been dissolved. Alex, good to have you on the show. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Andrew.
Now, before serving as a member of Parliament, you served in Afghanistan in the Canadian Armed Forces. Just before we get into what's happening now and how the government could or should be responding, how has it been for you as someone who spent time there as part of the coalition, seeing all of this work over the last 20 years just being unraveled in the span of a few weeks?
Well, that's a tough question, Andrew, and I've been getting lots of feedback from colleagues of mine and even people still in uniform, and it's tough. It's disappointing. It makes you kind of question sometimes, hey, could I have done something differently? Could the whole coalition have done something differently to address the challenges that Afghanistan has faced and now will face going into the future? I'm still a bit of a glass half full, not right now with the, sort of the lack of action on getting those Afghans out that need to be brought out and that are fleeing for their lives. But just from the fact that we did, the coalition, Canada in particular, we spent, the better part of a decade, 15 years there, the coalition writ large, almost 20 years, and we've educated and helped educate a generation, and this is a generational sort of change. That's the challenge with any counterinsurgency and the sort of full spectrum operations that occur today in today's contemporary operating environment. And if you don't understand that and understand that really ultimately the solution for Afghanistan has to come from the Afghans themselves, and that is through a long process, I'm still optimistic. There's a whole generation that now realize that they can have more, and ultimately, you never know, one of those young girls that was educated and got educated due to the impact and influence that we had historically, as Canadians and as the coalition. I think that there is a potential there that maybe one of them will be, back down the road to future Prime Minister of Afghanistan, and that the country eventually will come out of this. But unfortunately, right now they are going through some very tough days, and I think we now have to do our part in particular to help those that helped us when we needed help to help them.
And you are right to point out there are two aspects of this. There's the what do we do long term about the Taliban. We know that we've been down this road in part before with the Taliban running the show and then being ousted and having a democratic government replace it. And then there's also the here and now. And those images of people just, clinging on to the wheel of an airplane taking off and falling, I think will be burned into all of our memories for generations to come. You mentioned the Afghans that helped Canada, and I'm having trouble with this because Justin Trudeau has said that the government's on top of it. They're all getting evacuated from the region. I mean, what's the breakdown here? What isn't happening that we're being told is happening?
Well, so part of the challenge is the lack of transparency and just how much information is being put out there, because what we're hearing from people and colleagues and connections right into Afghanistan is that they have no way to communicate and get their names, and there's lists and there's names of people and Afghans on the ground and Canadian citizens. I know of Canadian citizens that are on the ground there that are hunkered down and having that same problem of getting in contact with the appropriate Canadian authorities, with the embassy, etc., so that they can actually find their way and get to that safe location and link up to get evacuated. I know the government does have stuff ongoing, but the problem right now is that lack of communication and that ability to get that clarity and information to those on the ground that need to get out. And, this is right, goes back to last week when they made that announcement. I was happy to hear that they're planning on getting 20,000 Afghans out. And I think Trudeau's even mentioned up to 21,000 now. But I raised this concern over a month ago in the public through a statement, through a letter to a national paper saying, look, you have a very short window to do this. Anybody that saw this coming knew that you only have a couple weeks, and now the Taliban have capitalized on the U.S. withdrawal. They're now in Kabul. They've successfully seized so many of the key crossing and border points, so it's going to require even more effort now to get these people out than if we would have taken action sooner.
This may be a difficult question to answer, but I'm curious at what point you think that window closes and it becomes too risky to put Canadian soldiers over there. I know they're very well trained. I know that the U.S. is still controlling the airport for the time being, but at what point is it too risky to do all of these things we need to do?
I can't honestly answer that without access to, what I would have had when I was still in uniform, the intelligence sources, the information on the ground. But ultimately, I think that the final deadline is September 11th. That's from what I understand, the U.S. has indicated that they intend to have every one of their forces out of Afghanistan. So it's tied to our coalition partners, it's tied to our allies and what they can do. But ultimately, our Canadian Armed Forces are well trained, as you mentioned. They are prepared to do this. And ultimately, you don't make any decision from a foreign policy or a national defense perspective without some level of risk. But every soldier, sailor, air crew in the Canadian Armed Forces knows that. We signed up for that. It's a voluntary military here in Canada, and we knew right from that's what makes our service personnel unique, is they're willing to make that supreme sacrifice if they have to do the right thing and what our government decides to do for us as military personnel. So ultimately, I can't speak to the exact timeline. I just know that window is closing very, very quickly. And the Taliban aren't an organization. They're a terrorist group that will not respect the rules of law and the international rules of law. They're not afraid. They're killing people. They'll hunt them down and commit terrible crimes if we don't get these people out immediately.
Obviously, it's the U.S. that's driving the withdrawal, and the U.S. withdrawal that's triggered a lot of this. But I'm curious where you think Canada could have played a role, if it could have, in mitigating some of the damage up until now.
You mean with respect to getting these people out?
Yes.
Yeah, well, so as soon as the U.S. had indicated that withdrawal was coming months ago, I can't remember whether it was February, March, or when they had indicated under President Biden that they were going to do this, that's when the government should have clued in right off the get-go, because we have phenomenal planners. I've worked in our Canadian Joint Operations Command in the planning team there. They could have spun this up in no time flat and started putting these programs in place to help getting these people out, because we were tied to that September 11th deadline. So they should have been able to, hey, here's the drop dead date. What's their background? What are those triggers in a planning process that go, oh, geez, Taliban have now seized this. All right, well, this speeds up the timeline. So the planning could have all been easily done if the will was there, but ultimately the Canadian Armed Forces follows the direction that they get from our elected officials. It's up to the government to provide that direction, and then the military will provide options.
I don't like politicizing something that should be a very unified issue. And I believe that, genuinely speaking, Liberal candidates, Conservative candidates, NDP candidates all want what's best for Canadians and Afghans here. But I do have to question a bit about the amount of attention that's being given to this, because we have Justin Trudeau on the campaign trail. I know the acting chief of the defense staff is also in Hawaii for a conference with other chiefs of the defense staff this week. Have you gotten the sense that this is being made a priority by some part of the government or some part of the armed forces?
I can't speak for the armed forces, obviously. I'm not in, and I try, especially right now and everything going on, I don't want to put any of their, for my personal connections at risk for anything that's politically tied. But I mean, it's no different than the statement that myself and Michael Chong put out the other day, saying, look, the Minister of National Defense, Immigration, Foreign Affairs, they should all be, ceasing their campaigning right now and focused on making sure their efforts done on this, and getting this out. And I mean, I think that is the only real political consideration is when this crisis became so evident, in the last couple of weeks, it does question why why Trudeau decided to call an election when I think personally he could have held off on that decision. If he was still set on calling this election, that's fine and dandy, but at least get this piece of it done first and foremost to make sure that guidance was going out there and that the focus by the ministers was on dealing with this international humanitarian crisis that, to me, is more important than any election. Canadians aren't going to remember who won or lost an election necessarily, or that that MP themselves or that candidate, as much as they're going to remember whether they did the right thing or not in helping prevent this crisis. And right now, these ministers have that ability to influence this and focus on this more than just getting reelected.
Alex Ruff, Conservative candidate for Bruce Grey, Owen Sound. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Andrew.
That was Canadian Armed Forces, Afghanistan veteran, and Conservative candidate in Bruce Grey, Owen Sound, Alex Ruff. My thanks to Alex for coming on the show. We will have lots of different candidates from different parties in the shows to come over the next few weeks, so fear not. We will hopefully get to some of those who have unique stories or unique angles on issues. We obviously aren't able to cover every candidate from every party in each of the 338 ridings, but we want candidates of interest, ridings of interest, and issues of interest where a candidate has some expertise to speak on it, like in the case of Alex Ruff and Afghanistan.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.